Well, ahlan wa sahlan, everyone. Welcome again to the Gin and Tonic Show. This week we're discussing the historicity of Muhammad and the early Muslims. Was he the Socrates of Islam, a figment of the imagination of the caliphs or the early people later described as the companions to portray this paragon of virtue of their religious faith? Or was he, in fact, the political figure depicted in the traditional version of the story, the orthodox interpretation? We'll discuss that and many other things. If you'd like to join the show at any time to discuss that topic, any other topic we're discussing, or a topic having to do with Islam, the Middle East, the Arab Spring, anything you'd like to discuss, religion or philosophy, feel free. Just send a contact request to us at The Gin and Tonic Show on Skype. Please don't call into the show. We will call you when we're ready to have guests. If you've already sent a contact request, then just send me a message on the contact list sidebar, and I'll bring you in when we're ready. Please tell me when you send the contact request or comment how you'd like to be introduced and what it is you'd like to discuss. Also, all guests, when you come on, please make sure to mute and minimize your Blog TV window. Otherwise, you will see and hear everything twice, once on a delay, which will disorient you and disrupt the flow of the show. Also, all guests are advised that this is broadcast live on Blog TV and recorded for a later upload on YouTube. Okay, so stop spamming. Kick it off.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. What we need to do is we need to understand the circumstances surrounding the birth of the Quran and the role Muhammad played in the whole thing. One needs to look at the environment. So while Europe was transitioning from the Roman to the Byzantine Empire with roads, irrigation system, and a culture that included philosophical discourse and theater, Arabs, on the other hand, lived short and brutal lives in harsh conditions. There was no need and no time for arts, music, leisure, and apart from paganism, Arabs were surrounded by this spreading concept of monotheism and small groups proposing their own versions, such as the Hanifi traditionalism or the Sabaeans, who all influenced the traditions, folklore, and culture. So, if we look at Arabia, oh, by the way, the Hanifi traditionalism, this is not the mother, but the concept of monotheism before Islam, okay, just to point that out. So, Arabia was a barren landscape with little water, and people at the time were starting to farm only in the southwest, where there was a little bit more rain than in the east. The rest were nomadic herdsmen. There was no single language, there was no writing, which meant that all stories were transmitted orally. Muhammad's father, Abdullah, died before his birth, and the mother, Amina, died when he was 6, which means that Muhammad was left in the care of his grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib, for some years, and then lived with his uncle, Abu Talib. He is alleged to have traveled on camel caravans, trading oil, spices, weapons, pottery, and slaves. We have no reliable sources and are totally dependent on hearsay and accounts of people who lived centuries later, who reported that Muhammad soon started managing caravans on behalf of merchants and thus came into contact with people of many cultures and faiths. Now, this shows that, very similar to Jesus, we have years missing between childhood and when he was a mature man. He also had no formal education, no status, no influence. But 20 years later, he was the most powerful and richest man on the Arabian Peninsula. Now, in between, he was chased out of Mecca to Medina, and from there started developing his empire. We have no idea when this actually happened, as this was simply determined decades later. I mean, today we have exact dates when everything is supposed to have happened, but there is nothing that can verify this. Now, he hired mercenaries and when in Medina, and then started pilfering commercial trading caravans. And with his booty, he hired more people and started attacking settlements. And then he attracted more followers, and with more and more revelations flowing as required, he declared himself the 25th prophet, and his growing flock are called followers or believers. And now, this is where we run into the first problems. Multiple battles and conquests are recorded, but none by impartial historians. The role was filled by poets who recorded events and transcribed them as poetry, resulting in somewhat varying accounts. So I found very few secular historians, such as, it's probably Hekateos, but this was 1,000 years before Muhammad. I'm excluding Herodotus because he did not really travel himself and relied too much on second-hand information. Then we have Agathachides, who wrote 700 years before Muhammad. Diodorus and Strabo lived only 400 years earlier, but unfortunately, nothing during the most interesting time. So years later, now everything was done and handled by Muhammad. He was a statesman, a warrior, and family man. And too many things are now attributed to him, and I found conflicts within dates and occurrences. And this led me to question the existence of a single person. Because if I take, for example, the expulsion of the Jews from Medina, such as the Banu Qurayza, and this is touted as a huge victory for Muslims, it is hardly mentioned in the Quran. Well, you have 59:15, but that's about it, or in the Hadiths. Now, looking at the death of Muhammad, I found it extremely strange that in Hadiths we have similar stories, but with different endings. And in one we have Zainab, the Jewish Kaiba woman, who tries to kill Muhammad through food poisoning in 628. And this is not mentioned in the Quran at all, even though some try to assign 62:1-8 to this. And in Bukhari, there's a story that she was not killed, and Dawood says, yes, that she was killed. So in some accounts, Jews are acting as allies and others as enemies. And that is odd if it's the same person. But it's possible if it's different people. So what I did is I applied the hypothesis I adapted with Jesus, and it worked. It explained the differences in the personality and the character between the brutal warlord and the loving family man. If there were several people, all charismatic and outstanding for whatever reason, why not take the most prolific and then merge the others into that single person, and then serving as a role model for others? And voila, you have Muhammad, the messenger and prophet of Islam. And this is in line with people such as John Wansborough or other scholars who will say that the Quran is a product of belated and imperfect editing of materials from a plurality of traditions and people. So the way that I see it is we have several people who all have their own personalities, and they are merged into one person who is serving as an idol for the people and as a messenger, where Islam is now taken as a single religion, as a single narrative, coming through one God and one person, even though in reality they were different people who were transmitting this in different areas on the Arabian Peninsula, who were later merged as one person. And that's the way that I see it.
Sure. You wanted to talk about this because there was a particular school of prominent Orientalists who had brought up this thesis. Do you want to tell us who they are and what exactly they say? Not your own words at first, like Stop was saying, but just give us this argument that they present as they present it, and then you can go after that. You was the author and not later scholars.
No, not necessarily, because it could simply be that because when the Arabs first came into the Levant, into Mesopotamia, they were Bedouins. They weren't educated, so any initial attempts to create a holy book would have been sloppy, and then their more educated successors would have had to just deal with these mistakes and work upon them and just try and fix them. They would have been shackled with the with the mistakes of their predecessors, and so that in that way you could end up with a sloppy text.
Well, I mean, what I'm talking about is, in general, the poor form, the relatively small vocabulary and things of this nature. To me, it doesn't suggest that it's some sort of revisionist, because it would be better. And as far as the relative ignorance of the people living in that region at the time, I think we should avoid going down the same path that, for example, Hamza Tzortzis goes when he talks about the Hijazi Arabs, like they were in this force field and were just, living in caves, eating moss off the walls. I mean, they were relatively provincial compared to some of the surrounding civilizations, but it's not like there were no literate people, and it's not like there were no people. I mean, for example, they were, famous for their wordsmiths and poets, even if they didn't actually, even if they weren't actually literate. We do have, surviving poetry, both pre-Islamic poetry, some of which has been, edited to not offend, Muslim sensibilities. But, we have poetry that is contemporary with the Quran, which shows a much greater style. So we know, despite the arguments in the Quran and the arguments that many apologists come up with, we know that there were people at the time that were coming up with things that were much more eloquent, with much much broader vocabularies, displaying much more knowledge about the world around them based on interaction with the Syrians and Romans and Persians and so forth. So again, I don't think that we should, and also, excuse me, you also have the influx of the South Arabians, who had a much larger city-dwelling population, much higher literacy rates, many more people who knew about, many more scribes, and these people, there was this constant conflict between the North and South Arabians throughout these two cliques never really broke up. Most people, of course, know about the Sunni and Shia dichotomy and the conflicts that rise thereof, or therefrom, excuse me. But all throughout the history of the Caliphate, you had these two cliques with the North Arabs forming much of the warrior base, and then the South Arabs having a disproportionate number of the intermediaries and clerks, and they were sort of able to, they were like carpetbaggers. They ingratiated themselves into a position where they were pretty vital in terms of, running the government, which of course the North Arabs weren't in a position to do because they were mostly pastoralists and warriors. So, you had people from maybe, at least the Hijaz, but definitely in the entire peninsula. You had some people who clearly demonstrated that they were more educated, had access to more resources, and so forth. So I find it hard to believe that nobody could have produced a book that sort of reeks of a stronger literary. I don't know. That's what I'm saying. That would just be better. That would just be better than what the Quran is, because like anyone who's read it and done comparison knows. Despite this claim that it's impossible to create a book like it or a book as good or better, the fact of the matter is it would be hard to produce something as bad unless you were extremely sheltered and not particularly well learned as far as language and scholastics. So, I mean, you really think there was nobody either on the peninsula or someone that they tapped or hired in the conquered territories who could have written a better Quran linguistically?
No, but you need to look at now how everything is being brought together. Because if you take a look at the origins of the Quran itself, you will find that there are several people, each and every one with their own individual writing style, contributing. Which is why people like Hamza, who see the different styles, who says, well, it's neither poetry, nor prose, nor this, and says, it's a miracle. No, it's just different people writing their own writing style. And this is what contributes. And this is why you have such a mixture in the Quran, which, again, you have different people coming together, writing in different dialects, who are trying their utmost to bring together one single language, taking different accounts. And again, this is another reason why I think so, we have different people who are contributing to the person and personality of Muhammad. So it's everything goes hand in hand. You have different people writing the Quran, different people writing about different people, different Muhammads, and everything is being brought together in one book.
I will just say that a response to this would be that a lot of the Quran is translated from Syriac, so hence, and badly translated as well. So a lot of incoherence would have come from that, because it would seem that these early Arabs were very intricately linked to various forms of Levantine Eastern heretical Christianity, like Nestorianism, Arianism, and so forth. And so in the early days, I would assume they took a lot of their nascent religion from these Eastern Christianities. And so they would have held their holy books in high esteem and tried to translate them to form the basis of their own book. However, they translated very badly, hence so much incoherence.
It's from Syriac, yeah, so originally it went from whatever. Did it come from an Arabic edition that was written in Kufic script? And I mean, how did it come to pass through Syriac?
Yes, some scholars in Semitic languages, they actually suggest that the Prophet himself was using an ancient text or ancient prayers and hymns of the former people, as it says in the Quran. In 8:31, and when our verses are recited to them, they say, we have heard, if we willed, we could say something like this. This is not but the legends of the former people. So they always say in the Quran that it's legends of a former people, not for it's an ancient text. Just like when Joseph Smith used like the Middle Age English to write his book. I think that's what Muhammad did, and that's why Arabs later on had difficulties translating and interpreting the Quran and understanding what the Quran actually is saying.
But aren't Syriac and Aramaic close enough to Arabic that it should have been a relatively smooth transition?
Maybe it's a local language in Mecca or in Quraysh.
I mean, there are different languages, so...
Yeah, but they're different languages in the sense that Portuguese and Spanish are different languages, aren't they?
I suppose, but remember that the Arabic, when it was first written, was such a rudimentary language. So no vowels, no diacritical markings, no punctuation. So, again... not only translating from another language, but in writing it down in a language that was just so rudimentary, I think could help result in the book of such incoherence. But just hold that thought, because I just want to continue with all the evidence. So the Quran was produced something like nearly a century after Muhammad. And in fact, earlier, or Christian sources such as an exchange between a monk from Beth Hale in Europe and some Arab notable, has the monk mocking the Arab or criticizing the Arab, saying, "Look, not all your laws are derived from the Quran. Many of your laws are derived from the Torah." From the Gospel and from Surat al-Qara. And this is very common in early Christian stories. They make a very clear distinction between the Book of the Cow and the Quran, indicating that they were actually two separate documents.
Now, wait, he came from a tribe that already had a strong Abrahamic influence, but that wasn't necessarily Jewish or Christian, and of course had yet to be Muslim, right?
Well, hold on. Oh wait, who's this?
I watched a vid of yours actually, and you said that
Muhammad?
his particular clan, I guess is the breakdown of that unit, came from a group that practiced at least some, like store brand Abrahamic tradition. like a sort of syncretic mixture of the Arab Christian and Arab Jews beliefs and the Arab pagans. Isn't that true?
Well, yeah, I did say that, but here's the thing, right? First of all, just the point I was making with the Quran is that the Quran has radically changed its form, and that so there's been some really heavy. It had an original form, and it was put together, and so forth. And the one that we have today, roughly, there's still many variants even today. Even the so-called Cairo edition is not standard. There's different Qurans being used in North Africa and Iran and so forth. But in any case, the rough version that we have today was produced at the earliest during the time of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. So approximately 70 or more years after Muhammad. The oldest actual history of Muhammad comes from approximately 150 years after Muhammad is specifically listed, with the Sirah of Ibn Hisham. Not Ibn Ishaq. We don't have Ibn Ishaq. We only have Ibn Hisham claiming to be rescinding Ibn Ishaq. The earliest accounts of where the Quran came from are Ibn Sa'd and al-Bukhari, the earliest accounts of how the Quran was put together. Both living during the Abbasid era, both living during the the mid to late 9th century. And most of the earliest Hadith collections were assembled at the turn of the 9th century, so around 1800. That's Malik's Muwatta and Musnad al-Tayalisi, I can't pronounce this word, and Ibn Hanbal's Musnad. But most of the actual, the canonical Hadith collections were actually collected from the mid to late 9th century. So this is like 200 years after Muhammad is supposed to have existed.
Someone had some questions about the Surah of Al-Baqarah, the Surah of the cow. Why is it called that? If I'm not mistaken, it was primarily a reference to the golden calf used by the Israelites while they were wandering.
No,
is that right?
it mentions the story of the cow when the Israelites asked the Prophet. The Prophet told the Israelites that God wants them to sacrifice a cow, and then they asked him what kind of cow, and then he said it's a yellow one, it's a bright yellow cow.
My favorite story in the Quran.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wait, that I don't remember that full story's in the Quran, or it just mentions it.
No, it's almost the full story, yes, in this surah.
Huh. So, now, the fact that these historians refer to the Surah of Al-Baqarah as though it's a separate book, has that led you to believe that it was possibly a pre-existing and completely separate text?
Maybe. Well, I would say that the Quran was drawn together from many sources. It's mentioned, and right now on the spot, I'm not sure exactly who it was, whether it was John of Damascus or maybe it was Leo IX as the third. They mentioned that when Al-Hajjaj made an official recension of the Quran under the auspices of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, it said that he destroyed the Hadjarine writings. He destroyed the earlier Hadjarine writings. Hadjarine referring to Hajar or Hagar, who was which was like Hadjarine, sort of referring to I guess formative Muslims, those who believe that the prophetic tradition or the legacy of Abraham was passed down through Isaac and not through Ishmael. No, or it's the other way around. For the Jews, it comes down through Isaac, but for Muslims, it comes down through Ishmael, and Ishmael's mother was Hajar, and so Hadjarine texts. So, yes, I would say based on these early Christian sources, which actually predate all the Muslim ones, by the way, I would say that the Quran was put together from many different texts.
Yeah, but I wonder why they didn't try to pass the Surah of Al-Baqarah as another corrupted revelation, like the Torah, the Taurat, or the Injil.
Yeah, Muslim apologists say that it was called the Book of Al-Baqarah because this surah contains many laws. So it's a sort of a book of law. That's why they call it the Book of Al-Baqarah.
Well, it seems like it. Whatever. It seems like it only occasionally mentions. See, that's what I think. One of the things that really surprised me about the Quran is it's nothing like the Levitical law, where it goes, one by one in some legal code. There isn't even a section that's just dedicated to that. There's only a handful of. Like imagine you're stirring brownie mix and it's not quite stirred. There's a few chunks of the sugar that's sticking together. That's about how many different legal precedents you see sort of stuck in clumps occasionally. But there's no real categorization. There's no systematic. It's nothing. When you read the Hadiths, by contrast, when you read Bukhari, it's just, wow, this guy actually went to the trouble of organizing things by topic. Who would have thought?
Actually, on that note, some of you might be thinking, well, how could Muslims have made up all this material concerning the life of Muhammad? It just seems implausible, right? That they would just make up all these details of the life of Muhammad. Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, I think his name was. sifted through not 60 but 600,000 hadiths. 600,000. And of 600,000, he said only 4,000 were authentic.
Is that Al-Tabari or Al-Bukhari?
Al-Bukhari. So, I'm not very good at maths. What's 600,000 minus 4,000? 59, 59, what is it? 596,000?
It's one for every 150, I believe. So one out of every 150 of the hadiths he examined. And this is on tape, so if I got the math wrong, I'll never live it down. No, I did the multiplication just now. 600,000 with the end result, 600,000 divided by 4,000. That would be one out of every 150 hadith that he was aware of. Only that many passed the test. So that's a lot of stuff that got strained out. That's for sure.
But I mean, is that 596,000 hadiths that were deemed to be inauthentic? So, according to the greatest muhaddith, according to the greatest Muslim scholar of the hadith who produced the most authentic hadith collection, Sahih al-Bukhari, which traditionally every single hadith in that thing is meant to be authentic, right? Muslims, pious believers who believe in Muhammad or whatever, pulled out of their ass, completely fabricated 596,000 hadiths, just made them up. But hey, 4,000 of them were authentic. I mean, this shows that they were just making up hadiths, that there's a precedent here to just make stories up about Muhammad. I mean, the revisionist school contend that, don't stop, they're all fake. Particularly given that they date from approximately, they were all gathered to get actually written down to around 200 years after Muhammad.
Yes, I don't know if that's a concrete assumption that we can make, that they're all fake. I mean, if he was a man and he was alive and he had the power of speech, he must have said something and someone must have heard him. I think that people like Bukhari and Muslim are, to be commended for the attempt. And here's the thing is, I can identify with Muhammad al-Bukhari because whereas so many religious people seem to have a profound lack of curiosity about their religious tenets, he was born after Muhammad died, yes? I mean,
al-Bukhari lived during the Abbasid era.
Oh, okay. So long after he's dead. And yet
200 years.
Well, wait, when was
Even more.
when was Malik's Muwatta compiled?
Around 800. It's compiled at the turn of the 9th century, which is around 800, sometime like that.
Okay, well, now here's the thing. As far as the number of the sheer amount of disinformation, shouldn't that be expected of anyone, given that you have such a expansive time, so many generations, and the fact that the original people were mostly pre-literate? Isn't it expected that even if we let's grant, just all hypothesis, let's grant that Muhammad was a historical character, or anyone, given the same amount of time, given similar circumstances, isn't there an inevitability that there will be these sort of side chop down the cherry tree type stories?
I guess. I mean, I would think so. But see, if we grant the premise that yes, Muhammad did exist, we can't. That's it. That's all we can do. We don't know anything about him because the sources are so massive, so contradictory. What is it? Is it that Islamic sources collectively recall that Muhammad had 40 wives? Just all these different sources giving different wives. I mean, this is manic. There is nothing. There are no deep. There are just so many contradictory, so many variant stories. We cannot know which one is real. I mean, W. Raven, some random historian who I've never heard of, but he lists in this versions, what versions, and other essays in this collation of scholarly works and references. This is how he summarizes all the problems with the Sirah literature. Right? This is the biography of Muhammad. This actually predates the Hadith collection. This is the early, apart from the Quran. This is the earliest sources for Muhammad. That aren't reliable at all. 1. Hardly any Sirah text dated back to the 1st century of Islam. 2. The various versions of a text often show discrepancies, both in chronology and content. 3. The later the sources are, the more they claim to know about the time of the Prophet. 4. Non-Islamic sources are often at variance with Islamic sources. And remember, the non-Islamic sources are earlier, by the way, Christian sources and so forth. And 5. Most Sirah fragments can be classed with one of the genres mentioned above. Pieces of salvation history and elaborations on Quranic texts are unfit as sources for scientific historiography. Well, given that in brief summation, given that the Quran dates back to around 705 CE, the earliest biographies date from about 800 to 830 CE, around that bracket. And the Hadiths were written down from around 800 to 900 CE. We can know virtually nothing about Muhammad. All the sources are contradictory, and just the sheer volume of fake sources, according to the Muslims themselves, is just indicative that people were just making stuff up. Based on their own interests, based on their own experiences, people were just writing down their sources. But particularly, if they were actually fabricating a religion, then you would expect this, as people were making up their own stories to their own interests, saying, "This is how I imagine Muhammad to have been." You know, he definitely ate 7 ajwa dates or whatever. So I mean, and the Hashimi Umayyad divide, Sunni Shia divide, would have evolved in this context as the different political interests of the Hashimis and the Umayyads, i.e. Sunnis, would have manifested in this way with the Umayyads being in power, the Hashimis trying to legitimize their own claims to power in the Arab Muslim Empire by citing a special connection to the Prophet that they had created.
Been quiet for a while. Do you have anything to add to this, for or against?
Yes, actually, I want to play devil's advocate. I mean, I think it's unlikely that Muhammad did not exist. If he didn't, there are many things that it solves, as Michael Marx says, who is a German Islamic scholar. He says it poses more questions than it solves. Now we have the between the Shia and Sunni Muslims. It's supposed to have originated from a dispute over who could rule after Muhammad, and then it culminated with the civil war between the Umayyads and the Hashemites. The Umayyads could have easily, if they made up the religion, could have easily denied the descendants of. They might have claimed the descendants to Muhammad from Muhammad to themselves, if they or deny that the Hashima, the Ali, children of Ali, are descendants of Muhammad through Fatima. That would have been much easier for them. And this a matter of ancestors is very important for the Arabs, and you can find it even in the pre-Islamic pre-Islamic poetry, and it still survives to this day within the tribal communities of the Arabian Peninsula. It's almost like ancestor worship in one way or another. And also you have Christians, the Christians who also lived during the Umayyad era, like John of Damascus. By the way, John of Damascus quotes from Surah Maryam in his critique of Islam on the Orthodox Christian Information Center. It says that he says that Christ. Now I am quoting the translated manuscript. He says, quote, he says that the Christ is the Word of God and His Spirit, so and so on. Then he says he was begotten without seed of Mary, the sister of Moses and Aaron. And this, he was obviously mocking him because Mary was not she wasn't the sister of Moses and Aaron. And this verse is actually in Surah Maryam, and it's a rhymed surah, so this verse fits perfectly within it. It's all rhymed. And also he also mentioned some of the books. He mentioned the Surah of Women, and other surahs that are in the Quran. He says, quote, as even related, this Muhammad wrote many ridiculous books, to each one of which he set a title. For example, there is a book on women in which he plainly makes legal provision for taking 4 wives, and if be possible, 1,000 concubines, end quote. And then he also mentioned the story of Zayd, but he calls him his friend. He didn't say his adopted son. So the Christians of the time could have easily used it in their polemic writing that Muhammad actually never existed. It would have been easier for them to do. And also, if the Umayyads wanted so badly to impress the Christians of the Levant, they could have easily either embraced Christianity or created a cult in which Christ was the central figure. However, it's an Abrahamic text. Most of the stories are about Abraham, Moses, and other Jewish prophets. And it is also common with the other many prophets who came at the time of Muhammad, who were also mentioned in the Quran. The Hanafis. The Hanafis, i.e. the followers of Abraham. So probably there were many prophets at the time, and Muhammad just happened to be the one with the successful cult in Mecca, which then evolved more or less like what we generally know from the history books. Of course, it's full of myths and lies and so forth, and people had so many reasons to make up hadiths during that time because of all the political conflicts that happened. I mean, the Umayyads made up their own hadiths, and the Abbasids and the descendants of Ali and so on. Yeah, so that's generally my point. And then also I wonder if anyone has an idea, when did they start using the Hijri calendar? Because that might be also, the Hijri calendar sets the first year as the year in which Muhammad left Mecca for Medina. So I wonder if you have any idea, when did they start using this?
Kling,
Yeah, I guess so.
Kling, can you answer that?
Oh, I'm not sure when I started using it, but a lot of what you're saying has already been, I guess you could say, discussed or answered by how we say, Crone, John Wansbury, the revisionists. First, with the early Christian sources, I mean, like John of Damascus is operating in the 730s. So this is after the time of Abd al-Malik. So after the time when Islam is really forming, and that Muhammad has been decided to exist already.
Yeah, but his father was supposed to have served Abd al-Malik, though, didn't he? Well, he was an advisor.
But the point is that
So
by this time, in the Arab mind, in collective Arab mind of the new Arab ruling elite of the Middle East, Muhammad had already solidified over the previous decades, or over the previous 100 years rather, into a historical figure. So by the time of John of Damascus, I mean, he would have had no way to falsify that Muhammad never existed, because Muhammad is supposed to have existed in Arabia, and Damascus is living in the Levant. However, I mean, by analysing the very earliest sources, Patricia Cronin and Michael Cook, excuse me, I've got a throat infection, they actually came to the conclusion that Muhammad did not exist, and that and so forth, it's a complicated theory, and that the Hijra actually was the Arabs migrating up to the Holy Land, rather than someone going from Mecca to Medina or Yathrib.
Okay.
I have a question for anyone on the panel who knows. At what point, according to this new school of thought, at what point do we have our feet first on solid historical ground? Is it as early as the Orthodox caliphs, or are we looking more at the first fitna, Zubair and Ali and Marwan? Is it Marwan? No, not Marwan. Muawiyah. When the three of them have this three-way civil war, is that like the first issue? Because actually, I think that would fit.
It's Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan.
That's the first person that they feel is the definitive first historical
character. The first absolute historical. Everything before then gets more and more sketchy.
So if Abd al-Malik is the first historical figure that they all agree on, that would mean that all three parties of the first fitna, they were all fictional?
That, or they simply, the story has been changed, and that there was just a general civil war, or that they've been typified in some kind of religious narrative after the fact.
I would call it not unbiased.
Godless, did you have something to say? Someone was trying to speak up, and I
was trying to say that I would call it not unbiased.
Let Godless come in, and then we'll go to Stop, and then Frank.
Yeah, there is another source which is much earlier than the one about the one from John of Damascus. It's called Deuteronia Jacobi, which means the teaching of Jacob. It's a Greek text that mentioned that there was a Saracen prophet who came preaching with a sword and a chariot. And this source did not mention the prophet by name. It just says prophet. Does not say Muhammad. And it's allegedly written between 634 to 640, so 2 years after the death of the prophet. And Patricia Crone and Colin Willis both refer to this document.
Stop, you got something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I would not trust any source before that, and I would not call them unbiased. I'm not saying that everybody is wrong. I'm not saying they are completely, based on the void, but I would not trust them.
And Frank?
Yeah, I think, Kling, you didn't address the point about the Hashemite-Umayyad conflict and why the Hashemites also never used... No,
I didn't get the time.
Okay. And also, there was... also the historians...
I actually do have to reply to that.
Yeah, and also you have the historians who lived during the Abbasids, and those who also wrote in Umayyads Andalusia. Both, there were some similarities, quite very great similarities between them, although they were enemies, the Abbasids and the Umayyads. And it would have been, the Abbasids, if the Umayyads really did change this religion or fabricated the whole of it, they could easily use it as an accusation of heresy or of... but they never did.
Okay, but how do you determine which one is authentic?
I don't know why, but You guys all sound like robots suddenly. I now hear what
we've been robots all along.
hearing.
Anyway, well, it's
But,
fine.
I mean,
I can hear you. That's fine.
all right.
I don't understand Frank stop enough to respond.
Yeah. So first of all, I just wanted to go back to the thing about why didn't the Arabs just adopt Christianity? Simply Arab nationalism or Arab proto-nationalism. So, at the time of the Abbasids, according to I'll have to actually find a page, but according to
there were actually Arab Christians though.
Yes, but Arab nationalism was such, particularly leading up to the time of the Abbasids, but before then, that they created their own unique religious identity. That's just the explanation. As for the issue or the whole thing with the Hashimi and everything you're saying, also this is a response to you know how you've got early accounts of Muhammad about things that he did, and then later accounts that completely contradict this. Like, for example, the story of how Muhammad had sex with Maryam, or is it Maria, the Copt, the Coptic slave woman, in Hafsa's bed, on Hafsa's date, in Hafsa's house, and then Hafsa got really angry and so forth. Right? This is to explain a certain section of the Quran. But then you have another story which is completely different and completely watered down, which is they made up, Aisha and Hafsa were cheeky and they made up a story and so forth, right?
But the majority agree on the first story, though, right?
Well, I mean, Al-Bukhari has the second. He doesn't mention the first at all. So, I mean, and this is meant to be the most authentic. Now, with things like this, I would say, and this also goes back to the whole Sunni in the Sunni Shia thing, and what you were saying before about the historians, is that explanation would be that the earliest generations of the Arabs, the Arab conquerors, they established a rough narrative, a story, and then the second generation, as the opinions, as because remember that they're in contact with Christians and Jews and all the early civilizations, so as the cultural zeitgeist of the Arabs changed, so too with their perceptions, and thus this narrative would change slightly. And so, whereas one story in a previous generation was okay, and oh yes, everyone likes a story, now the morals or the ethics and the standards have changed, and suddenly this story is not okay. We can't have the Prophet cheating on his wife, so this story gets altered. And so with the Shia Sunni thing, already in the earlier narrative, which everyone is sort of familiar with, everyone is illiterate, so of course, and it's all oral, but still, it would be familiar with the core story. I mean, Muhammad has already been established as a Hashimi, so the Hashimi can use this as a basis for their legitimacy in building up their own narrative. So yes, the Sunni and the Shia would have the same basis. But
the children of Ali don't simply say we deserve to rule because we're Hashimis. They say we do so because we are descendants of Muhammad. We are descendants of the actual Prophet through his daughter Fatima. Yeah, and they've never been. This is something that the Umayyads never denied. They could have easily done so, but they've never done so.
Well, I have something to throw into the mix. I've heard it said...
I would say that by the time of the...
I'm sorry, let me throw something in really quick, Klingschor, and then you continue. Sometimes when I argue with Christians, they will say about certain stories from their scriptures that it contains content that's too embarrassing to the religion to be false. Do you think that this could be said of a great deal of Islamic lore and doctrine and history? Like the stories that you were just talking about, the scandal between himself and...
Oh no, this is...
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is exactly it.
Yes, I mean, the story with his son Zayd.
Sorry, I think there must be... I think there's a massive...
Yeah.
Yeah, you're cutting out badly. Godless, you were saying?
Yeah, I mean,
There
from
is
the
a
story
delay.
of the Prophet with his son Zayd when he wanted to marry his son's wife. It seems that the Prophet is manipulating his son and his companions
Why don't you tell
to
us?
achieve his goals.
Why
So,
don't you tell everyone the full story? Because I think sometimes on the show we take for granted the ratio of ex-Muslims to never Muslims in the chat. Many people may not be familiar with it at all. So why don't you tell us the full story?
yeah, well, basically, the Prophet visited his son one day, and he wasn't in the house, so he opened the door, and Zainab, Zayd's wife, was there, partially naked. So the Prophet liked her, and but he can't marry her because she's his son's wife. So he revealed a verse that prohibited adoption because Zayd was an adopted son. So after that, he just married her, and then when the Muslims, his companions, his friends asked him why, he said, "Well, God revealed to me this verse, and I can do this now." So, I mean, why would Muslims invent such a story? It seems that the Prophet is manipulating his son and companions
What
for
was
his
it?
sexual desires.
Now this was Zainab too, right?
Yes.
Yeah, this was the second Zainab. First one had died. Was this the same one? Was this the same wife for which he also got the revelation that he could have more than 4 wives?
Yeah.
No.
No?
No.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, actually, it's even more gradual because the first verse was the one that prohibits adoption, and then which nullifies that the Muhammad's adoption to Zayd, and then came the other verse. That's what some of the Mufassirun say. So the first one, ما كان محمد أبا رجل.
So wait.
Yeah.
You're saying that the Orthodox interpretation of these verses is that the practice of adoption is abolished?
Yes.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of verses that talk about the care of orphans. Are those predating it, or
Yes,
No.
no,
They say it's different.
you take care of them, but you don't adopt them. And
So-
when you ask Muslim apologists, they say, well, the Prophet did this. He married his son's wife to show Muslims that now adoption is abolished. So they reverse the intention of the Prophet.
but there's no dispute that he did engage in the practice of adoption prior to his getting this
Yes.
revelation. See, now
They
here's what I
argue
was.
that he adopted Zayd.
Now there was some disagreement about whether this was the one that caused him to get the other revelation that he could have 5 or more wives. But what I'm saying is this illustrates perfectly. These, I think, are pretty scandalous revelations when you take into account their timing and circumstance. So this seems to me to be the kind of thing that no later author, I mean, if Muhammad was a fictional character, it doesn't seem like anybody, I mean, or the religion as a doctrine has anything to gain by inserting these stories in. Because if he's made up, then all the stories are inserted, right?
Yeah.
So, again, just like with the Christian apologist device, some of this content is so humiliating, or suspicious at least, it gives it a bizarre kind of credence, I think.
Well, I mean, yes, that could be, or it could equally be that it's what was the narrative, which later Muslims were shackled with. The earlier narrative, it was okay in Arab culture at the time, in Arab society. It wasn't a problem. It was maybe seen as endearing or cheeky or whatever. And then as the doctrine...
No, Klingschor. It says in the Quran that the Prophet was it's God speaking to the Prophet, don't fear the people. So it was a shameful act, even to the people who, at the time of the Prophet. In the verse, it says the God is speaking to the Prophet, don't fear people, to show them what you have in your heart. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that could simply be referring to what was happening. I mean, so you have the early narrative being formulated, and at the time when the actual narrative itself was formulated, this wasn't a problem. But what they're saying was, at the time, it was a taboo for Muhammad, referring backwards. So because remember, the Quran was assembled over decades and decades. So at the time when that was actually put together, it would be that it wasn't actually a problem, and then later on it was. So, for example, Muslim tradition was always changing. In the 10th century, they developed Ijaz in the 9th and 10th century, Ijaz al-Quran, and suddenly again, verses take on new meanings. Now it's produced sort of like it suddenly means it's inimitable. So.
It's just a bit sinister that he would abolish for the entire Ummah the practice of adoption.
I know.
When he himself had been orphaned and taken in by other members. Well, he was taken by other members of his family. He wasn't like a complete orphan in the sense that he was like an urchin on the street. But certainly he lost his father when he was very young. Or was it before he was born? It doesn't really matter. Anyway,
before he was born.
The father before he was born.
Before he was born, that's right. Okay, so yeah, in at least one sense, he was an orphan. But to abolish the orphan, the thing is, I've conceded this point actually debating with Muslims before. They've said, well, the Quran says take care of orphans, so you don't think that everything in the Quran's bad, or you think this is bad. And I'll say, no, I'll admit that even, this book, despite my differences, it contains some pro-social content that I have no argument with. But this casts kind of a shadow on that, I think, because, now it just seems like he's overcompensating. I wonder how many of those verses that talk about taking care of orphans occurred after the revelation abolishing the specific adoption into your family, because then it just seems like he's compensating or either covering his ass or maybe he had some guilt about it. He's saying, don't worry, we'll take care of the orphans as a community and they'll be fine, but you're not allowed to adopt them. And I think that a community could take very good care of them, but I think that most of the orphans at least would covet a family relationship as just to be normal or normative. In addition to all the, we could, if we had a child psychologist on the panel, we would talk to them about the differences between being raised in an orphanage and being raised in a foster family, assuming the family's supportive and not abusive. But it just seems that a lot of orphans probably want to be adopted at some point, probably want something resembling normal family life, and for him to abolish their chance of ever receiving it, if the circumstances suggest that he had a selfish motive. To me, this is just one of a long list of things that suggest that these embarrassing stories wouldn't have been hoisted upon him by if he was a real person and they really admired him, or if he was created from whole cloth, or even a semi-mythical character, and they were trying to construct from scratch. The $6 million man, the 6 million dinar paragon of their virtues,
So there's a different rationale behind this, because what is supposed to have happened is that this was supposed to take care of the habit of adopting children so that you can get the inheritance. And he wanted to stop this. This is why he said, don't adopt them, so you have no legal rights, but take care of them nevertheless.
Chat referenced the hadith where Aisha says to him, I think it was on the eve of his marriage of the fifth wife, or some other incident. She says to him, it seems that the Lord is quick to fulfill your desires, or something like that. So, take that, for example. That is an authenticated hadith that occurs in Bukhari and I think some other collections. So, again, you have, some very unflattering stuff that it doesn't seem that they would put in. There are some things that are unflattering only from a modern lens. Cutting off the hands of thieves must have seemed much less offensive then, especially when you have other contemporary surrounding cultures also engaging. You have Romans crucifying people, so dismemberment and death were common. But of course now, that's an unflattering policy from our perspective. But there were things that it seems like, regardless of time and place, point to manipulation and duplicity on his part that I don't think any culture would, reinvent their leaders to in that sort of an image.
I agree. And here's the verse which preceded the one, supposedly preceded the one in which God commands Muhammad to marry Zainab. It says Muhammad is not, it's Surah 33 verse 40, and it says Muhammad is not the father of any of you men, but he is the messenger of Allah and last of the prophets. And Ibn Kathir, in his interpretation, he says not the father of, he says it means he is not the father of Zayd, and therefore he could marry Zainab. And yeah, and it's even in Ibn Kathir. So if they made up, indeed, if they made up if they wanted to make up a prophet, they could have made a better one.
Right. I mean, yeah, like if the stories, and not just him, but all the characters involved were fictional, it seems like they could organize all these things. But one thing I wanted to go back to, we were talking about Bukhari versus the Muwatta, right? Now, give us a brief rundown, anyone who wants this or feels that they know the most, about who these two people... These are the two most influential collections of hadiths. But even, if I'm not mistaken, even though the Muwatta was compiled much earlier, like hot on the heels, less than a century after the death of the Prophet, I mean, assuming that he died at the recorded time, and then you have Bukhari much later. But Bukhari, because of its more... because
Muwatta was compiled like at the same time that Ibn Ishaq, later even. Like, it was like 150, nearly 200 years after Muhammad.
Was essentially the first to compile a compilation.
Yeah, but it was extremely late. It was more than much more than 100 years after Muhammad.
Now
he was born in 715 and died 796.
Okay,
Right.
So were there already? Okay, I'm very poor with dates. Were there already biographies and histories prior to the Muwatta?
I think Ibn Ishaq.
Okay. So, but you still have the Muwatta being a very influential text and much earlier, but considered less authentic for the most part than Bukhari, even though Bukhari is much. I mean, okay. So now, who was in charge? Who was the caliph during the lifetime of Malik? Does anyone know?
I think he lived in, I mean, during 3 caliphs or something.
But was it Umayyad, middle Umayyad, or the opposite?
No, opposite. The Abbasids took power in 750 CE.
Oh yeah, the Umayyads didn't last. Umayyads, I guess, didn't last as long as.
Oh, they lasted like 100 years or something.
Yeah, I guess.
More even.
Okay, so a lot of these things are forming opposite era.
Most of Islam was formed during the Abbasid era. The Sirah, the Hadiths,
But you have that the one edition of the Quran being compiled by under the auspices of the Crow. What's his name? Not the Crow. The schoolmaster, Al-Hajjaj, right?
That was during the Umayyad.
That was during the Umayyads. So the Umayyads have that under that accomplishment under their belt, right? And then you have all these different I guess quasi-secular accounts of the histories and the biographies, and then you have Bukhari. But Bukhari came how many centuries after Malik?
Oh,
Several,
70
yeah?
years? No, 70, maybe 100. So the Muwatta would have been completed shortly, like maybe a decade or so before 800. Bukhari died, I think, in 870.
Okay, so not as long as I was under the impression. But Bukhari is more venerated because he's credited with inventing hadith science as we know it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've completely forgotten where I was even going with this because I think my whole point was predicated on the Muwatta being much earlier.
Well, I mean, the Malik's Muwatta isn't even like a canonical. I mean, it's good, but I mean, it isn't even one of the 6 canonical hadith collections. So I guess probably by that reasoning, Malik's Muwatta is less authentic than Sunan ibn Majah.
Okay, if anyone wants to call into the show, send a Skype contact request to the Gin and Tonic Show. Make sure to include in your contact information or with your contact message how you'd like to be introduced and what you'd like to discuss. We lost some time because of technical difficulties. Now, on a side note, let's change topics just for a minute. We can come back to this. Stop, you've been sparring with Hamza again, yeah?
Yes.
Go for it.
Nah, come on. I mean, I didn't even notice this. Somebody sent me a message saying, okay, that Hamza had commented on my videos and my comparison with him with Dr. Craig. And he didn't do this in the text as such, but he did this in a comment that announces his own lecture in St. George or something. And I looked at this and I initially thought, nah, come on, this is not even talking about me. But then after a while, I realized it might just be because he's referencing Dr. Craig and he's suddenly parroting, vocabulary that I used in the video, like the waffling, which he hasn't used before. So I decided to take a look at this. And initially, I just saw, I don't know, 10, 20, 50, I don't know how many spelling errors, and I sort of chuckled. And then I thought, hang on, what is this guy on about? So I decided to take a sentence-by-sentence look at this, and then I just made an answer. I have not had any response to this, no idea, because he's blocked me. Wherever Hamza says something, he blocks me so that I can't talk to him. And then he says, yo, you're not talking to me. So it's totally stupid. But it's fun looking at this because it's so primitive. It's so childish. It's so... it's amazing. I mean, you have this avatar, I realized, of this little boy who's standing there with his arms folded and throwing a tantrum. And this is exactly what this reminds me of.
Text blurb in the description of the vid you made addressing this. And it starts off, it's a very real, this is Hamza speaking, it's a very real, very rational argument that the Quran can only be from the Creator. Now, is that just something off his site, or was that part of his rebuttal to you?
He says that all the time.
Right, but this specific thing that you copied here, was it something he said to you just in this time that he addressed you?
Sorry, what did I copy?
It's some text, and it says, it's a very real, very rational argument that the Quran can only be from the Creator.
No, this is his assertion.
Right. I'm just wondering, is this something he said in his specific... I'll copy so you can read it, and I'll put it in the blog TV chat.
Is it a direct quote?
Well, what I'm saying is this something that he said recently to you, or is this just something you saw on his site? Because I just find his manner of speech and argumentation is just so comical. I can't imagine anybody in actual academia saying, hi, my name's Atheismo, I wrote this really good paper, it's really, really good and oh so logical, and my arguments are so sound, you're going to really enjoy it. I argue that the Tocharian languages, pose beyond the shadow of a doubt a link between the Sino-Tibetan and the Indo-European languages, and it's really, really, I mean, who makes these kind of, repeated, front-loaded subjective praises of their own argument or paper? He doesn't understand, I think, that if he ever aspires to do anything other than preach to the converted, it's as though he's sort of dangling his keys for the sound it makes in front of an infant. It's kind of an insult to the intelligence of anyone who hears his preamble to these kinds of things.
Yeah, but he doesn't realize that. He still uses it, and he still thinks it's a valid argument. This is the whole point. This is why I laugh about this, and I say, how can that be rational? It is not rational. And I even give him the definition of rational and show him that it's not valid, that it's stupidity that is driving his arguments.
Can I just say that, yes, Hamza... in an event in central London, April 2008, Hamza is recorded saying, it's a very real, very rational argument that the Quran can only be from the Creator.
Yeah, I love that. This is a really good argument. It's really good and really real and really logical. I mean, that cracks me up every time I read it. We have our first caller. It's Alexander. He... wants to talk about something in the Quran that suggests that Muhammad was a historical figure. Are you with us? Alexander.
Yes, hello.
Thank you for calling in. Go for it.
Yes. What I was going to say was, I mean, I know I agree with basically everything you've all said so far, but there's well, there's one thing to me which suggests that, at least in some form or in some way, that Muhammad was a real person who lived in kind of that general area of the world, and who, in some way, thought that the Abrahamic God was talking to him. Like this, you know, we're all familiar with the moon splitting verse.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the thing is, obviously, when the you know, the Hadiths were written, they actually acknowledged that it was a solar eclipse, and not the moon being split in half. And the thing is, I mean, obviously at this time they did quite a lot of editing and revisions of the Quran. So, and the thing is, they didn't, and even despite knowing that what a solar eclipse was, they still didn't edit this part out. You know, as the rationalizer said, this was more than likely referring to a solar eclipse that happened over Mecca and the surrounding area in the Arabian desert, roughly in the year 613 CE. So that to me suggests at least a slight allusion to the idea that, you know, that there was a 7th century Arab who thought or that he was being talked to by God. I mean, it doesn't prove anything else, any of the specific details about his life, but you know, I'm just sort of putting this out there.
So wait, I remember the rationalizer talking about this. Was there actually a solar eclipse over Mecca?
Yeah, it was. Oh, I can't remember. It's the kind of eclipse where the outline of the moon is completely within the sun, but the outline of the sun from the perspective on the ground is bigger than the outline of the moon. I've forgotten what it's called now. Yeah, I think it's called an optical eclipse.
Grammatical form. So even, I mean, the guy that was making this Big Bang argument, you know, he got caught red-handed, you know, lying about it being a verb. He said it was a verb and it was really a noun. He said it was present progressive and it's really a present perfect, but, you know, a past tense, right? So there's two bald-faced lies right there. But in addition to that, if that one verse is saying that the universe is continuing to expand, then the next verse would be saying that the earth is continuing to grow as well. It's continuing to be spread out because it uses a similar grammatical form. So, you know, there are some people who will sort of regurgitate these things because they themselves don't know any better. You have to keep in mind that, you know, a lot of people are susceptible to these kinds of things, and most Muslims worldwide don't speak Arabic at all. You know, but the people who the people actually come up with these things, they're just bald-faced lies.
Yeah, like Zakir Naik, for example.
Yeah, what's his name? Hamza Yusuf is especially bad about this. I don't think I've ever heard someone say so many lies in such a short space of time as he did when he was talking about the verse about, you know, how to punish your rebellious wife. It was really nauseating. So, yeah, I hope we answered your questions. Did you have anything else before we let you go?
Not really a question, but I always thought it was weird when, like when the Quran talked about embryology, that they said, then we made the dropper clot of blood, instead of then he made. I always thought that was very weird. And it kind of amazes me that people think it's a miracle. I mean, if they, like, I saw a video of Yusuf Estes, if you know who that is, the American guy who converted to Islam in 91, and he's like 69 years old.
I'm not familiar. What does he say?
He says that, how could they know this, that the blood was a blood clot? I don't know how they could. They were, inspired by Allah, by divine revelation or something. And I mean, if a woman gets a miscarriage in an early stage, it's a blood clot, you know. I mean, it's so.
These Quran miracles are really, really obviously false. It's not about the Quran miracles. It's never. No, I mean, I don't think. I think very few people have actually converted to Islam simply because of the Quran miracles. More often than not, they're actually looking for a religion, or they're actually looking for some kind of rock to base their life upon, some kind of ideology. And then when Islam comes along and says, hey, I've got science backing me, people just go, oh, great, science, cool. You know, science is true, Islam must be true, huzzah. I mean, if you simply read this stuff, it's a crock. It's all a crock. They're all so patently, you know, fraudulent and absurd. So you have to have some kind of previous...
The only way they even make any headway with these so-called miracles is telling bald-faced lies about what the text actually says. Because if you can get away with that, think about it. If you can get away with rewriting the text, then you could make it fit any miracle of your liking, you know? If I have free reign to rewrite a book as I see fit, I can make it say anything. I mean, it's like, imagine if I have a book written, you know, like I used to own a copy of the complete quatrains of Nostradamus, and many of them, of course, people read things into them and so forth. But if, in addition to that, I had a French edition of the quatrains, and I was speaking to someone who spoke no French, and I had a free hand, if I so desired, to make up whatever I wanted, and they had, you know, had no way of testing my interpretation of the French. You know, my ability to deceive them if they don't look into it further or get a second opinion is basically unlimited. So there is a means by which they can employ this quite effectively, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with the Bible when God says, and he hangs the earth on nothing. I think that's in Job. But in Job, it also says that he has cast the earth on mountains or something. So what are we to believe? You know, it's so fucking inconsistent all the time. And it's so vague and, yeah. And that was all I had. And before I go, I just want to say that I think this is an amazing show. And sorry for my English, I'm from Sweden.
No, yeah, we understood you just fine. It's better than my Swedish.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you.
Take care.
Goodbye.
Okay, so anything people want to add on that topic before we move on? Oh, yeah, that's right. Someone sent me a message asking what is the Islamic equivalent of the Dead Sea Scrolls, if there exists such a thing? What after the
Sanaa manuscripts?
The Sanaa manuscripts?
I would say.
Well, what about the Samarkand text that you mentioned earlier?
Well, that is. I mean, there are variants, but there's variants with most Qurans. But it's more or less the same Quran that we have today.
But the Sanaa manuscript, those manuscripts,
they're a mess.
What were the circumstances under which they were found?
They were found locked away, stored away in the roof of a mosque, where they had been stashed. Stashed,
as in a mosque where? Do you recall?
No.
In Sanaa,
hang on.
Yemen.
It's a mosque in Sanaa, and what happened is they took documents and texts that they didn't know what they were, stuffed them into potato sacks, and used them as insulation in the roof of the mosque, which started leaking. So what happened is that these potato sacks then were saturated in water, and then somebody said, let's get rid of these. And then somebody said, yeah, but hang on, look at this text, recognized it to be something that he'd seen before. And then they said, oh, let's look at this. Took a second look, found out it was Quranic text. Then they went and said, okay, who is able to, number one, recognize what this is, and number two, separate the papers from each other without damaging them. And that's when they went to the German university in Saarbrücken, to Gerd Poon, and he and his team went in there. And what they did is then they separated the pages, photographed them, and identified them. And then what they did is one by one, they cataloged them, put them together in the right order, and so on and so forth, to create a consistent documentation of the whole process, what they found. Now, what they found is three different things. One is texts that preceded Islam as such. How did they do this? Well, some of the documents were, the borders contained drawings of certain things. So if you had the drawing of a mountain where there was no building in the middle, you knew now that there is a building in the middle between those two mountains, so it must have been before that building was built. The second thing what they found is that some of the documents contained Quranic texts that were different from the ones that we have today. And the third thing that they found is that there were palimpsests. In other words, they had rubbed out certain pieces of the writing, and underneath there were Quranic texts in different orders with different words. Now, they took the photographs, took them to Germany, and they have been looking at those ever since, but I don't think that they will be releasing them anytime soon because they're too worried about the implications.
So this is sort of the equivalent of the Dead Sea Scrolls find in multiple ways, in that not everything that was found was anything to do with the Quran, right? It sounds
Correct.
like it was kind of an eclectic collection of texts that just happened to contain Quranic verses.
No.
No,
Some
no,
of
no.
it was
It's
Quranic.
all-
Some of
it's
it
all-
was Quranic and some of it was not. So they had it is similar in that not everything was Quranic. Some of it was just some stories, but most of it was Quranic text. Yes.
But in a haphazard manner, strewn about. Not there were large sections missing.
Correct.
Was there anything there that, as far as we know of their analysis, was there anything there that doesn't appear in the standard modern Cairo edition?
Well, this is the problem. The original texts were locked away in Yemen because the government did not want any more involvement from outsiders. So was it the religion minister or the minister of culture or something like that? Anyway, he called them in initially, and then he fired them when very, very quickly they were sent home, when it became apparent that the text differed from what we have in the Quran. So we will never know. I mean, we don't know much more than that. We only have a couple of minutes interview with Payne. We have a couple of documents, and that is it.
But the cat's out of the bag in that somewhere in Germany, someone has complete scans of the texts.
Well, we don't know if they're complete. We just know that this number of over 30,000 photos. We don't know if that is complete. We don't know what this is, whether it shows the palimpsests as well, or whether this is just sporadic photographs. We don't know.
So what was the content of some of the other books? I mean, some of the other writings, the non-Quranic writings that were found? Just
nobody knows.
Nobody knows? You'd think that they'd be more willing to release manuscripts that weren't related to that. You know, because, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls had a variety of different writings.
Yes,
they had
but the thing is that they want to keep this. Okay, this is my speculation, all right? I think they want to keep this as quiet as possible to not attract any attention to any part of this.
Yeah, I bet. Someone else had something to say, and I cut them off.
Kling had something.
Well, I actually thought Godless or Frank, I saw one of them light up. No? Okay, Kling?
I have nothing.
Oh, okay. I saw someone light up other than stopping myself, so I thought...
Me too.
I mean, apart from the fact that, according to Andrew Rippon, who is a great scholar of the Quran, many of what the Sanaa manuscripts indicate is that many of the verses in the Quran actually began as hadiths, or they began differently. Like they actually began as a list of things that Muhammad is supposed to have said, and were then incorporated into the Quran as the Quran itself.
Oh, here's something I wanted to ask about the historicity argument. Where would you fit in the allegedly lost verses that are mentioned in the Hadith about the verses that the goat ate? I mean, this is a story we kind of chuckle when we tell it. You know, I mean, for those who aren't familiar, haven't seen a previous episode, because I know we've talked about this before, there's a story from the authenticated collections.
Sunan ibn Majah.
Yeah, well, there's certain portions of the Quran that were eaten by a goat, a yard animal that came into the house when, according to the tradition, what is it? This is when Uthman's edition is being compiled, right?
No, Muhammad had died. Aisha was out mourning. Whilst that was happening, a goat snuck into her room and ate the parchment upon which was written the verse of stoning and some other verses.
Right, but it was only significant because she was supposed to be sort of sitting on the manuscript that Uthman was going to base his definitive edition on, right?
No.
No?
It's just that there was just a parchment upon which was written this, and yeah. I mean, we also have traditions saying how, from Ibn Abu Dawud, so this is Abu Dawud's son, saying how, like, when the Battle of Yamama was fought, right, and lots of the Quran memorizers were killed, a lot of the Quran was also lost. And that was actually what inspired, made them actually put together the Quran. That when the Quran memorizers died, they actually lost parts of the Quran.
Yeah, I recall that. I was reading in Philip Hiddey's book. He says there was some scholar who bemoaned how much of the religion had died on that battlefield because so many. I mean, that's a lot of the apologists will extol the virtues of keeping a tradition or a history alive by word of mouth, but obviously it has its weaknesses if everybody gets killed, and sooner or later they were all going to die off. But I'm talking about like incidents like.
Can I read you something?
Well, one sec. I'm talking about, for example, the verse on stoning, which is mentioned in the Hadith as having been part of the Quran, as part of a surah that was lost. This, in particular, following the same train of thought that Frank and I were on before, it raises more questions than it answers, as he said. If this appears, if this anecdote, this version of the story with the verse on stoning being lost, if it first appears in the era of the early Abbasids, where you have the works of, you have the Muwatta, Bukhari, and Muslim being written, if that's the first they appear, or the first that they're written down and considered canonical from the Sunnah tradition, what sense does it make for them to make that story up? Is this a result of a rivalry between them and another sect?
Well, I mean, as I said before, with the whole generations thing, earlier generation makes stories, and then the later generation change their views and so forth. So, I mean, these stories, I mean, when taking the revisionist line, when the figures of Aisha and so forth are being invented, stories were invented about them, about their lives and so forth. And these would just have been stories that were made. I mean, remember, Ijaz al-Quran was only invented in the 9th and 10th centuries, particularly in the 10th century, as a proper doctrine. So it wasn't as important before then that the Quran was perfect. Well, it wasn't at all important. Like it wasn't a big staple for Islam as it is now. So things like this, stories like this, would have been acceptable. And then, of course, the doctrine of Ijaz al-Quran becomes prevalent, and suddenly all these become, inauthentic. And now Muslims deny them all, so...
Yeah, it's... the story about the goat, I think, is, just comedy gold. You can't get around it. You can't get around it. It's just, there's nothing you can do. I try to avoid, since we started the show, outright polemics against people both alive and deceased, and I try to avoid. One time when we had Nadir Ahmed on, I try to avoid like laughing right in the face of a guest, especially the Muslim guest. But there were a couple of things where I just couldn't mute my mic in time and laughed at him. But in particular, I think that the goat story it's just funny, and it reminds it's the parallel of the story in the Book of Numbers that's very few Christians are aware of, where Balaam, the Arab poet seer, is called upon to curse the Israelites, and on his way, his donkey talks to him, right? Because the donkey can see an angel on the path, and so it keeps saying, "Oh, we're not supposed to go this way," and so even though Balaam can't see the donkey because he's a non-believer, Balaam can't see the angel. He can, in fact, see the donkey. It was not an invisible talking donkey. It was only a talking donkey. But the donkey explained to him the situation, and I just thought it bizarre that the animal could see this angel and not a human being, even if he was a non-believer. And then you have this goat who is sent to, put in some last-minute editing of the Quran by chewing up these pages. So it seems like, between this and the role that the camel played in the conquests, it seems that whenever, Allah's or Yahweh's human servants are found wanting or weak or foolish, he just sends an ungulate to finish the job. They're really remarkable creatures. He should just have made he should have just made the prophet a camel. He should have just had the angel Gabriel talk to a camel, teach him to talk, and if you had a talking camel, walking around, I'm pretty sure everybody would have listened to it because it's a talking animal. I'm just saying.
Oh, there was another talking goat, by the way, and
Wait,
a
what?
resurrected one. Another talking goat in the. I'm not sure if it was in the Sirah or in the. A Jewish woman poisoned a goat and prepared it for Muhammad, and so as they were starting to eat, the goat came back to life and said, "Do not eat me. I've been poisoned."
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, so
I'll see that.
why could the goat talk, but the lamb that was poisoned and fed to Muhammad, the lamb couldn't talk?
Yeah.
So ungulates are lambs ruminants? So I guess my theory is consistent so far, in that the magical power that the ungulate super family of animals has, it just doesn't extend. So I guess they just tried again. They said, "Darn, if we had only known." I mean, she has no excuse. If she was a Jew, she should have known the story about Balaam, and she should have known that there's magical talking, donkeys and such, donkeys and goats. She messed up, but they tried again with a poisoned lamb, I believe, and I guess lambs just don't possess the ability to come back to life and warn people of danger.
Sheep and goats are apparently descended from the same animals, so I don't think your theory holds up at all. I'm sorry.
Oh well.
But
empiricism was not my friend this day.
I just thought I would read you this. This was recorded by Jalal ad-Din as-Suyuti in his Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran. Abdullah ibn Umar, which is Umar ibn al-Khattab's son, reportedly said, "Let none of you say I have got the whole of the Quran. How does he know what all of it is? Much of the Quran has gone. Let him say instead, I have got what has survived." And it's also recorded by El-Sijistani. This is Sunan Abu Dawud. This is his son, who also he collected a book called Kitab el-Masahif, where Umar inquired about a verse of the Book of God. On being informed that it had been in the possession of so-and-so who had been killed in the Yamama wars, Umar exclaimed the formula expressing loss. We are gods, and unto him is our return. Umar gave the command, and the Quran was collected. He was the first to collect the Quran. And this is sort of repeated, where basically also in Kitab el-Masahif, Zuri reports, "We have heard that many Quran passages were revealed, but that those who had memorized them fell in the Yamama fighting. These passages had not been written down, and following the deaths of those who knew them were no longer known. Nor had Abu Bakr, nor Umar, nor Uthman as yet collected the texts of the Quran. These lost passages were not to be found with anyone after the deaths of those who had memorized them." So,
now, wait, the Battle of Yamama was during
against Musaylama.
the Ridda conflicts or the original conquest of?
Ridda.
Okay.
Against Musaylama the liar.
So now, how does this piece of the puzzle fit in with the theory? Why is it so problematic for these people to die, or is it just I don't know? Is it a convenient excuse for the people who later made this character up to explain what a tapering off of witnesses?
I don't know. But ad hoc. I mean, to be honest, this is all, I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
I haven't actually decided whether or not I think Muhammad exists. Probably he did exist. But in line with the revisionist thought, I would say ad hoc that simply the early narrative to explain where the Quran came from. Of course, all of this written down during the Abbasid era, so 100 years or so forth after. But I would say more than 100 years actually. Definitely, if it's Ibn Abu Dawud. Anyway, the original narrative that was posited for where the Quran came from was that it was collected after Muhammad's death, and then these stories developed about what was the inspiration behind collecting the Quran. And then it was that people had died in Yamama. So that would be that explanation.
Okay, so any last comments before we wrap things up? Personally, I think it's interesting. I'm glad we gave it its day in court, but I think that Muhammad, in my view, still enjoys the distinction of being the only historically accurate, or at least historically plausible, founder of an Abrahamic faith. We'll go left to right, starting with Godless. Any closing comments or anything you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, well, I would say that Muhammad did exist, but not as he was portrayed in the Islamic tradition.
What specifically? Like the night journey? You don't think that kind of thing happened?
No, I mean, the whole Hadiths and the Seerah, and how he conquered most of the Arabian Peninsula is just not true.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Maybe he was just a cult leader of a cult that existed maybe centuries before him, and he was just the most famous of them.
Well, even before I was aware of Klingschor bringing this new school of thought to me, I was aware of a group that thought that the Ridda conflicts were not a reconquest, but an initial conquest, and that during Muhammad's actual life, he consolidated the western Yemen and much of that side of South Arabia, and then the Hijaz, and that the Ridda conflicts were not a reconquest on the part of Abu Bakr, but an initial conquest.
Yeah.
It was a little bit late in the game, but what do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't think maybe he united the Mecca and Medina, and that's it. Like everything else happened after he died.
You're not even going to throw in Taif as a bonus?
Maybe some tribes of Taif, but I don't think he united. Most of the conquering happened after he died, after his death, at the time of Abu Bakr and Umar mostly.
Klingschor, closing comments.
Apart from the Sanaa manuscripts, which are an absolute mess and have all these problems with them, the earliest Quran seems to date from the time of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan at the very earliest. The earliest, and of course the Quran is vague. It's ambiguous. It's convoluted. It's incoherent. A very, very poor source for the life of Muhammad. The Sirah biographies were written. The oldest ones were actually available to us. Were written down 150 years after Muhammad is supposed to have existed, and they are inconsistent with each other and contradictory. I mean, Ibn Ishaq says one thing, Ibn Hisham directly contradicts this. For example, did the Qurayza Jews choose the man who was to decide their fate, or did Muhammad choose the man who does decide this fate? Ibn Hisham directly contradicts Ibn Ishaq, and so forth. And then the Hadiths themselves were collected approximately 200 years after Muhammad. I mean, there were collections earlier, but I mean, the earliest, again, 150 at the earliest. And of course, according to al-Bukhari himself, of 600,000 hadiths, 4,000 were authentic, showing that Muslims were prone to just making these stories up anyway. So what we can assume from this is, or what we can conclude from this rather, is that definitely there are massive problems, and if Muhammad did exist, we can know very little about him. And it's very difficult to establish what is real and what is just pure fiction.
Frank, closing thoughts.
Well, I haven't really made my mind up. I haven't read the arguments that the revisionists who think that Muhammad never existed are. I just read a few articles actually just today for the show. But I still hold, I mean, somewhat to the idea that Muhammad actually existed. Maybe, I mean, definitely most of the seerah and the hadith have been fabricated. Or maybe others that were dismissed by the narrators were actually somewhat genuine, but still there are many things that would be inexplicable if Muhammad never existed. Namely the thing that I mentioned earlier, the rift between the Shia and Sunni, and the never disputed claim by the descendants of Ali that they are descendants of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima. It would have been a political advantage for any of their opponents to deny their descendants, but that never happened. And the Umayyads could have claimed this to themselves if they were actually the people who made up the whole thing. So, yeah.
Stop spamming.
I have no idea. Okay, I think my opinion is in line with the creation or the authoring of the Quran and the person of Muhammad, where I think that a person made up maybe 20-25% of the Quran. The rest is all a compilation of different people who wrote them, which also explains why you have these HM and ALM and ALV. These are just the signatures of the scribes that wrote this. That Muhammad was actually a person who existed, but the complex personality that we see is a compilation of several characters, of several people who were all merged into one person to represent an idol figure.
Okay, I'm going to make a special exception. I know I just said we were going to wrap it up. Someone has messaged me with a question about the last episode, saying if Islam had I'll read it exactly as they wrote it. If Islam had never contributed to science at all, and that it was in fact Arabics. I'm sorry, some of the way that's phrased. I may have to answer this person offline because I know I said we're going to wrap up if I can't rephrase it. Then it was in fact Arabic science. Then how come pre-Islamic Arabs never contributed to science like that of Islam-inspired Arabs? So it seems, and he can correct me if he's wrong. He's not ready to come on camera. He's messaging me. It seems he's saying, why weren't the pre-Islamic scientific contributions equivalent or better? Quickly, if you're listening, I know there's lag. Message me back because we're trying to wrap things up. Is that what you're asking? Is why weren't the pre-Islamic scientific achievements better? Okay, well, I'm sorry. There's lag and there seems to be a delay as he formulates. I really wish you had gotten here. Okay, he just said yes. That's what he's asking. Okay. In response to that, and I'll try to be brief because, like I said, we're wrapping up the show. Really wish you had either gotten here later, or I noticed you, or you if, again, in the future, just send me the contact request to Skype to send it to the Gin and Tonic Show and send me messages there. If people are shy or have bad connections, we're always happy to answer questions in text or from the chat wherever I notice it. It's sometimes hard to juggle the show and notice questions being asked in the chat. I would argue that the pre-Islamic civilizations, all of them, did in fact contribute greatly, and that just as Western tradition and history really gives, I think unfairly, Middle Eastern scholars during the Middle Ages the cold shoulder, I think in turn the Muslim version of the history really gives the cold shoulder to all the pagan civilizations and really goes very far out of their way to single them out. With the Quran calling many of the polytheists a people without knowledge. But if you look at the accomplishments of the Indians and the Chinese, and of course the local civilizations, the Persians and the Byzantines, many of the pre-Islamic Semites, you have the what are they? I can't think of the name. The Carthaginians were part of this family of people. Can anyone help me out? Nobody. It's on the tip of my tongue.
Sorry, say that again.
Where are you going?
The Phoenicians. I can't believe I didn't remember that. The Phoenicians, for example, polytheistic Semitic people, both the Roman alphabet and the Gnostic script based off of a Phoenician writing system. Okay, you have the Egyptians, who are a Hamido-Semitic people, and they, of course, had great contributions. You had the South Arabs, who had polytheistic great contributions and so forth. You had a wide variety of pre-Islamic people who made great contributions, and I think it's a shame that all of the wrong lessons are taken from that period. In that, the Muslims are and Middle Easterners, they're well within their right, and I think fully justified in taking pride in their accomplishments like any other civilization or society. I think the problem is that they just don't give due credit to the people who went before or who came after.
Well, I mean, what they do is, very ironically, they say that we in Western civilization owes this massive debt to Arabic science, which is true, for its foundations. Although, I mean, only for the foundations. I mean, however, the same is true that the Arabic science owes a massive debt to Greeks.
Yeah.
And then the Greeks owe a massive debt to the Babylonians.
Right, exactly.
So,
and again, yeah, you have the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who again were polytheistic Semites, and they're treated very harshly by the Muslim tradition. So my answer is that I think they did make very great contributions, and that when we try to put the Islamic ages of inquiry into this kind of perspective, it's not that we're trying to downplay the significance or grudgingly spit in the eye of these minds that came before just because we have these differences of opinion on religion. It's that I think it's in poor taste if there's like a Nobel Prize being accepted by a team of scientists and one Arab scientist grabs the microphone on the podium and says, "It was all me. These other losers had nothing to do with it." I just think that it really lacks perspective. And but of course, I think that's what they have to do in order to say, well, lots of civilizations had ages of inquiry, but ours was special and miraculous and so forth. So I hope that I answered your question. I hope that I answered your question. If not, please come on. We do a show every 2 weeks. And you can keep bringing up whatever subject you like. So that's it for the show. Also, since DPR Jones was kind enough to record for us, I feel it's only right to give a shout out to the Magic Sandwich Show, our sister show that broadcasts on weekends opposite of us. They broadcast on Sundays, whereas we go on Saturdays. And this upcoming week they have Sean Faircloth and some no-name Richard something. I don't know. I'm sure they'll throw a promo video up. I've been talking to DPR. He's just in a blind rage because we got PZ Myers, so he's got some guy lined up. I don't know if he's a theist or atheist or whatever, but some people apparently have heard of him because you don't name drop someone unless they're a name. I don't know. I don't really follow the Magic Sandwich Show that closely these days, Anyway, so thank you all for coming. Thank you for all the panelists and the callers.
You can find us on Facebook, which will be linked below. Also, Hamza Kashgari, linked below.
Yes, please support Hamza Kashgari to the best of your ability. Just like with the Sakine Muhammad thing, I think we're all frustrated in how little power we actually have in a situation like this, but it's just a shame I didn't bring those up during the show. For someone to be plucked up from one end of the earth and dragged over almost a full hemisphere and dropped off to possibly face the death penalty for tweets, relatively harmless one, is chilling. And to think that the scimitar of a Saudi headsman, executioner, has the same reach as a cruise missile, or a, an ICBM, is pretty unsettling. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Assalamu alaikum.